Thank you. We'll leave it to
Okay.
you.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And super excited to be here talking to you all and to be able to have the opportunity to share my research around advancing inclusion in the ecological science. And so I'm going to be drawing from sort of this decade or more of doing research and practice on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I say it's in the ecological sciences, but because DEI or DEIJ, I'll sort of use those terms interchangeably, because these issues aren't unique to any given field, what I'm going to be sharing is broader than I would just say the field of environmental data science or ecology. Most of these insights, I think, extend well beyond even just science. So hopefully you'll take away something useful and interesting from this talk. And then another note, I'm going to glaze over a lot of the methods. So feel free to use the Q&A time to ask more questions around that. So let's see if I get this to move forward. Nice. Okay, there we go. So sort of set the stage for the work that I'm going to be telling you about. I think it's good to back up and think about the research that I do. So I was traditionally trained as a conservation scientist. I do a lot of research focused on acoustic ecology, more these days on urban ecology. Also, I'm interested in human-wildlife relationships and human-wildlife interactions broadly. But I've also much more started to do research in the social science space. And I was not trained as a social scientist, so I have collaborated with many social scientists on these projects to sort of support the work that I was doing there. But I do these days quite a bit of social science as well, and all of this research is focused on advancing social justice, diversity, and inclusion in academia and in science more broadly. And then more and more these days, I am blending these two themes and looking at my conservation science from a social justice lens. And if there's time, hopefully I'll get to an example of that, a brief example of how I'm doing that. But I want to start out by sort of framing this talk about why we should care about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I can certainly make many arguments. I could make many ethical arguments, which are valid and important. But I want to, because I'm talking to a group of scientists, make the scientific argument. So research has shown that diverse teams are more productive and innovative, have better problem solving and decision-making skills, and produce higher impact research. And it produce research that's more relevant to society because the scientists themselves reflect that society, that broader community better. And so what I want to share with you is some insights that I have from doing this work, advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in environmental science and ecology. And so I have 6 sort of key takeaways that I'm going to go through. So the first is actually not drawn from my research, it's drawn from practice. It's drawn from doing DEIJ for over a decade and learning lots of lessons along the way. And so that takeaway or that insight is that DEIJ work is really a journey, it's not a destination. So after years of doing this work, I still not reached the point where I feel that my knowledge is even close to complete. And it's a journey of self-discovery and of societal discovery. And this work is very emotionally and physically draining. And so the takeaway here is that I really think we need to be able to give both ourselves and others that sort of grace and space to learn and grow along their journeys, and recognize that people are at different places on that journey. And so I think this is really relevant right now as diversity inclusion is becoming more politically contentious and divisive, is that, you know, I think it's important to sort of educate people, help people be aware of these issues, but also give them grace if they're making mistakes along the way, because we're all at different places on this journey. So that's one insight that I've gained from just doing this work for quite some time now. Okay, the rest of what I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to draw from different examples of research that I've done. And this one is that creating inclusion starts with you. So if there's one thing you take away or remember from this talk, I hope it's this. I truly believe that if we want to make our institutions, classrooms, labs, educational spaces, workspaces more inclusive, we need to start with ourselves. So we need to start with building our own awareness, our competency around DEIJ issues. And when we do that well, we will be better at creating inclusive, supportive, and welcoming spaces. And when we do that well, we will attract diversity. And this seems simple, but I believe that a lot of institutions and individuals start at the other end of this hierarchy, right? So if we get more diversity, we're going to fix our diversity problem. And I believe that we should really be flipping that narrative, right? We should be starting with ourselves, understanding our own biases, our own privileges, and building our DEIJ competency. And that will cascade into more inclusive spaces that attract diversity. And this insight is supported from a recent study that I conducted with Dr. Liba Pachar, where we were interested in developing a framework for evaluating diversity statements in the faculty hiring process. So we surveyed experts in diversity, equity, inclusion across the US to get their opinion on what factors would make for a strong contribution to DEI, and then should be therefore used to evaluate candidates. And so we also had some other questions, but what I want to draw from is that aspect of the study. So we obtained responses from 205 experts in DEI. These included folks like diversity officers, deans of diversity in a college, chairs of diversity committees, as some examples. And so going back to my point about diversity and inclusion really starts with you. These experts commonly cited having sort of cultural or DEI competency to be really important for being able to demonstrate a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So 38% of their responses referenced something towards DEI competency or cultural competency. They referenced other factors that could demonstrate a commitment to diversity, including track record of actual actions or accountability for DEI work, infusing DEI into your teaching and service, also actively promoting and supporting your underrepresented scholars, so including students and colleagues, and then also integrating DEI into research that you do. But I want to back up and go back to that DEI competency component, because I think that highlights the point that I was making on insight number 2, that competency was deemed to be really important by DEI experts across the country for demonstrating a commitment to diversity and inclusion. And these things include awareness of one's own bias and privilege, and society's bias and privilege, and colonialism, and how the legacies of colonialism and other inequities shape the way that marginalized groups experience the world. And also having a clear understanding of DEI concepts and terms, like a common cited thing was just knowing the difference between equity versus equality. Also having a record of training or certifications in DEI, and then understanding yourself, right? That self-awareness piece, recognizing how your own privilege, bias, and learning edges show up in all the roles you play as a mentor, as a teacher, as a researcher in your science that you're producing and the way you're interpreting your results. So these are things I think that every environmental scientist can work on right now, right, to improve inclusion. These are things that start with you. They don't require some big institutional initiative. They can all start right there with you. Okay, the next insight is that representation matters, but it's important to be mindful of what's called the diversity tax. So as a Latina scientist, I often reflect on the importance of giving, for example, guest lectures so that other upcoming Latina scientists can see themselves in a similar role. But these activities also come at a cost to my time, and guest lectures are not highly valued in tenure and promotion. So I'm careful how often I say yes to these types of requests. And this tension in my own experience is reflected in a couple of studies that I want to highlight now that I worked on with some great teams. And so the first I'm going to talk about is this paper that came out several years back now, looking at the gender gap in distinguished speakers at professional ecology conferences. So we were interested in this topic at the time because we rarely saw women distinguished speakers at our own institution, and we wanted to know if this pattern was more common. And our questions were pretty basic. How often are women represented in these distinguished speaking roles? And does the proportion of women speakers align with the proportion of women in ecology? And does representation of women speakers vary across different subfields or types of talks? And so to answer these questions, we reviewed abstracts of distinguished speakers at North American ecology conferences from 2000 to 2015. We categorized speaker genders using their pronouns in their bio. We also then, to compare the speaker data set to sort of the broader professional pool, we did the same thing. We collected pronouns from faculty websites to quantify the gender ratios that were current in the faculty pool in the environmental sciences. And then we also collected grad student gender data. This is in the category, their category of the life sciences from NSF and NIH. So combining several different data sets. And what we found was that women were underrepresented, or not at least represented as distinguished speakers at parity across all the years that we looked at. So again, this is a little bit of an older study. We looked from 2000 to 2015. And we found that women were represented from anywhere from 15 to 35% in these distinguished speaking roles. And that is much lower than the representation of women graduate students, which was slightly above 50% across the years where data were available. And just a note here that the speaker data included 809 speakers at 221 North American ecology conferences. And then in the year of 2015, when we were compiling all this data, we compared the percentage of women speakers that year to the percentage of women in the assistant, associate, and full professor level from when we went to the faculty websites and collected pronouns. And so what you could see here is that the proportion of women speakers does somewhat mirror the proportion of at least faculty, even though we recognize that's not the entire environmental science professional pool. That was the data available that we had. So this suggests women are being selected based on their availability in at least the academic pool. And we believe this is an example of the leaky pipeline. So the lack of women in these upper level positions may partially explain the lack of women speakers, or at least that they're not represented at parity. We also wanted to look at gender ratios by ecological subfields. And some fields have higher representation of women distinguished speakers, like animal behavior and restoration ecology. And then fields such as entomology, landscape ecology, herpetology, and ichthyology have much lower proportions of women speakers. And more women speakers or distinguished speakers represented as panelists as opposed to award recipients, keynote speakers, or plenary speakers. And I would argue that a moderator or a panelist is a less prestigious speaking role than an award recipient, keynote, or plenary. So these data show or suggest that women distinguished speakers are being represented similar to the proportion of academic professors at least, but are not represented at parity. And they're not represented to the degree of women that are entering the profession, at least at the time of the study. So it's important to close this gap because research has shown that having women role models improves early career women scientists' self-efficacy. And because distinguished speaking roles are important for career advancement for anyone, regardless of career stage. What can we do to close this gender gap? Well, we can certainly institute policies requiring gender equality in distinguished speaking roles. We can provide family care accommodations or on-site childcare by reimbursing family care costs because research has shown that women play more of a family caregiver role. And we could also include greater representation of women on selection committees as some examples. Okay, representation matters, but we need to be mindful how often women and other underrepresented faculty are being tapped for activities that don't lead to tenure and promotion. So invited talks and distinguished speaking roles are valued, but many activities that women and underrepresented faculty get tapped for aren't rewarded, especially many DEI-related activities. So in another study I want to share, my colleagues and I were interested in quantifying faculty engagement in diversity, equity, and inclusion because we believe that underrepresented faculty were playing a disproportionate role in advancing DEI. And so to address this question, we conducted a national survey of ecology and evolutionary biology faculty across the US to understand what DEI activities faculty engage in, how often they participate in these activities, and what are the demographics of faculty associated with doing DEI engagement. So we had responses from 469 EEB, or ecology and evolutionary biology faculty, and I'll just jump straight to what we found. So we found that minoritized and underrepresented faculty, including those that identified as racial or ethnic minorities, women, and first-generation faculty, put more time into DEI activities. So they spent more time recruiting minority students and faculty, doing K through 12 outreach, serving on diversity committees, organizing and attending diversity workshops, and authoring diversity publications. So, and another important part of the study is that faculty reported that this work was not valued in their tenure and promotion process. So they were doing the heavy lifting of advancing DEI without getting any sort of reward for it. And this has been described by other authors as the diversity tax. And so these findings suggest that we need to be more thoughtful about how that workload of advancing DEI is distributed and how it's rewarded and incentivized. And so how can we promote shared responsibility for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? One thing we can do is invest institutional resources. Some examples of this in my department, we funded TA lines to increase the inclusive content in our courses and to work on DEI initiatives. You could also provide financial incentives or awards for exceptional DEI performance. I'm seeing more and more of this showing up. Another thing that I think would be really useful to move the needle is to place greater value on these activities in tenure and promotion. And this isn't completely unusual, or maybe it is unusual, but this isn't unheard of. So Purdue University created a path to tenure that centers work on DEI. So alternative models to tenure and promotion are being used. All right. The next insight I want to share is that inclusion matters in the field as well. So I'm going to share a couple of my recent studies focused on explicitly on inclusion in field work. So why care about inclusion in the field? Well, studies have shown that field experiences are critical to the recruitment and retention of all students. Field experiences, which I'm including field technician positions, field internships, various field experiences are all under this category. But these field experiences have been shown to improve graduation rates and GPA scores, help students develop specialized skills in global thinking, improve student self-efficacy, help students clarify career intentions, provide links between college and career through applied learning and networking opportunities, and all this leads to increased student retention. Yet it has been suggested by several authors that field experiences are not accessible to everyone due to low pay, long or non-standard work hours that conflict with family care responsibilities, a lack of accommodation for those with mental or physical disabilities, and sometimes outright discrimination, harassment, and unwelcoming work environments. But there has not yet been a study to understand actually what students across diverse backgrounds prioritize when they're seeking out field experiences. And to address this question, my co-authors shown here on the upper left, and I conducted a national survey to understand, first of all, what pay do students need to meet their needs? Do they have needs other than pay? Do they experience other barriers to participation in internships than not having enough pay? And what do field experiences currently pay? This was during 2018 when we collected data. We received responses from 1,225 undergraduate students at 397 institutions of higher ed that grant degrees in the environmental sciences. And what we found was that indeed limited pay was a barrier, especially for those that identified as racial or ethnic minorities. So 43% of our respondents, regardless of identity, indicated that a lack of income was a barrier to their participation in a field experience. And again, across the entire pool of respondents, regardless of identity, on average, they indicated that they needed to be paid $8.68 per hour to accept a field experience that provided housing and transportation. So a full-time summer job, essentially, that provided housing and transportation. If the student identified as a racial or ethnic minority, they indicated that on average, they needed to be paid $10.80 per hour to accept the same internship or field experience that provided housing and transportation. And we found that many positions did not at the time pay enough to attract diverse students. So there's a lot going on in this graph, and I'm going to orient you to that. So here on the y-axis, we have the percent of respondents that were retained in our applicant pool. So in our respondents that would have been retained at different wage benchmarks. So the first is this average underpaid wage. That's the average amount of the jobs that were posted to the various job boards we looked at that we classified as underpaid or below federal minimum wage. There's minimum wage, which was $7.25 at the time. Average needed wage, so that was that $8.68 I referred to. Average paid job wage, so this is the average of jobs that were classified as paid or greater than federal minimum wage. Double minimum wage, and then the amount needed to retain 90% of our respondents, which was $20 per hour. And so across different identities, whether they're pooled or Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, or those with lower incomes, we found that only 65% of jobs that were posted to the different job boards that we looked at paid the amount that across the whole pool people said that they needed to earn. And only 35% of the students that identified as BIPOC would actually be retained at federal minimum wage. And the average underpaid wage really just did a terrible job at retaining anybody, regardless of identity. And then only 3% of jobs posted to job boards actually paid the amount needed to retain 90% of our respondents. And we found that, of course, limited pay was a major barrier, but also other barriers exist to participation in these internships or these field experiences. So here you're looking at the distribution of basically barriers that participation that respondents identified, and this is the distribution across all respondents. So in this question, a subset of students, 191, we essentially asked a question about, are there things we haven't asked about that are barriers to your participation in these experiences? And 191 of our 1,200 or so respondents filled in that information. And even though we asked about pay very clearly, still 20% said pay or not enough pay is a big problem. So overemphasizing the idea that these jobs are not paying enough to support our students. They identified other factors that were barriers as well, including season or timing conflicts with these internships, conflicts with work or school responsibilities, lack of transportation, family care conflicts, mental or physical health concerns, hostile work conditions and environments, concerns around lack of qualification, lack of housing, lack of professional development, or lack of inclusive and safe workspaces. So that's the entire pool of respondents, and that same distribution will show up in the next set of graphs I'm going to show you. But we looked at those that identified as BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And in this case, those students indicated that pay was a really big deal. So 0.4 as opposed to 0.2 of those respondents said that pay was a big barrier, or lack of pay. Those that identified as women indicated that a lack of transportation, family conflicts, and health concerns were more important to this group than to the pool as a whole. For those that identified in various queer identities, lack of transportation, work or school conflicts, health concerns, hostile work environment concerns were bigger deals than for the pool of general respondents. And then those with disabilities, family health or family care concerns or conflicts, health concerns, and a lack of inclusive spaces were barriers that existed more for them. Okay, so what do we take away from this? Attracting diverse students is going to definitely require better pay than at least was occurring in 2018 when we did this study. Also flexibility for students that need to work near their school or family. And then efforts to increase inclusion in working conditions and address some of those inhospitable working environments. And we recognize that employers are not going to be able to meet all the needs highlighted here, but we think these findings could be useful to identify targets that can be used or modified to support the needs of diverse students. So I want to pivot now to a study that I recently completed. I was mentoring an undergraduate student in their honors thesis. So Mo London focused on promoting LGBTQ+ inclusion in field experiences. And Mo's paper was recently published in Ecological Applications. And in this paper, Mo and I identified several important ways to make field experiences more welcoming for LGBTQ+ students. And so I'm going to go through some of those here. And so one important practice is using gender inclusive language, avoiding gendered language, encouraging the use of pronouns, those types of things. Also gender neutral gear, so providing non-gendered gear, avoiding assigning gear based on gender is really helpful. Also having LGBTQ+ sensitive medical and emergency response, so ensuring that medical and emergency respondents use LGBTQ sensitive practices and protect patient privacy, and much more. Also LGBTQ+ travel or inclusion in travel and accommodation, so gender neutral bathrooms or backcountry latrines, gender neutral housing and accommodations. Having LGBTQ friendly community guidelines, so encouraging participants to discuss and develop community guidelines that set norms and expectations on pronoun use and sensitive discussion topics and more. Also having LGBTQ+ inclusive fieldwork and outdoor activities. So for example, informing participants when outdoor activities may reduce privacy. And then finally, developing LGBTQ+ competency among leadership and participants. Super important that staff are trained in basic diversity and inclusion topics like the use of pronouns, the difference between gender and sex, having gendered language, etc. So I'm really proud that Mo was able to publish this work in Ecological Applications and to see this work get out there. Okay, and that ties really nicely to the fifth insight I want to share, is that by and large, LGBTQIA+ inclusion matters in the environmental sciences. And so I'm going to share some work now that is very hot off the press. So I apologize, some of the graphs and figures might be still a bit rough because we're still cleaning some of this stuff up, but I'm gonna share some results from a national survey that my team and I conducted, sorry, there's a kitty, of conservation biologists, ecologists, environmental scientists to understand their experiences of safety, belonging, and inclusion in the environmental profession. And so we received responses from 737 academics, federal and state agency, NGO, and private sector professionals. And among these, first looking at gender identity, 79% identified as cisgender and 10% identified as gender expansive. So here, gender expansive includes gender queer, gender nonconforming, questioning, non-specific, gender fluid, transgender female or male, agender, two-spirit, indigenous, or intersex. And then 11% did not give us a response about gender. And then we also asked about sexual orientation, and 64% identified as straight, and 29% identified as what we call queer plus, which includes those that identify as bisexual, queer, lesbian, gay, asexual, pan-omni, questioning, or non-heterosexual. And then 6% gave us no response around sexual orientation. And I want to point out that although these numbers may seem somewhat low, they're compared to all other studies I've done where we've collected demographics actually quite high. Usually those with gender expansive or queer expansive identities are well below 1% of our survey respondents. So we were sort of intentionally trying to reach LGBTQ folks and get their voices heard and have them show up in our results. And, you know, I think the results suggest that we did at least get some decent representation. Okay, so what did we find? So the LGBTQIA+ community, probably unsurprisingly, has decreased feelings of safety across all of the different workplaces and environments that we asked about. So here, those that identified as gender expansive had a lower, much lower sense of safety than those that identified as cisgender at conferences, in public work settings, in their personal life, in public non-work settings, in the in-person workplace, and in remote workplaces. Similarly, those that identified as queer plus had lower feelings of safety in those same spaces than those that identified as heterosexual. And you can see here also that around sexual orientation, there was a little higher feelings of safety than around gender identity. Okay, similar results for feelings of belonging. So those that identified as gender expansive had a lot less or a much lower percentage of time feeling belonging in their personal life, conferences, public, work outside, in person, or in remote settings than those that identified as cisgender. And then similarly, those that identified as queer plus felt less belonging in all of those spaces than those that identified as heterosexual. And here I'm showing the raw data, and we actually ran models and sort of looked at a whole bunch of other intersecting factors and demographics about people's identity to see if anything else explained feelings of safety or belonging. And it was really a very strong signal about whether you identified as queer plus or gender expansive was the strong signal of what determined whether you felt safety or belonging. And other aspects of people's identity didn't show up very strong in our models. And we also asked a question about whether the environmental science, ecology, and conservation profession was inclusive for the LGBTQIA+ community. And probably also not surprisingly, we didn't find a lot of evidence that people felt like it was inclusive if they had an LGBTQIA+ identity. So those that identified as gender expansive, you can see here that the distribution is shifted more towards strongly disagree than strongly agree. And those that identify as cisgender, the distribution is shifted more towards strongly agree. Similar results for those that identified as queer plus, distribution shifted more towards strongly disagree, although I'll note that somewhat agree seems to be very similar for those that identify as queer plus to those that identify as straight or heterosexual. And again, you have the distribution shifted more towards strongly agree for those that identify as heterosexual. When it comes to who the LGBTQIA+ community feels safe with and safe coming out to specifically, if you identify as gender expansive or queer plus, the pattern is still the case that you feel safer coming out to friends outside of work or school, chosen family, colleagues at work or school friends, and then sometimes mentors at work or school, and less safe coming out to colleagues outside of work or school, your biological family, office or campus as a whole, and members of the public at work or school, and then other categories. So we asked some questions to sort of unpack individual experiences and sort of understand the themes that emerge around people's experiences with safety and belonging. And some key themes that emerged from some of the responses included that people felt safer or more inclusion when they were able to pass as straight or choose not to be out. They also, a lot of respondents referenced safety or inclusion really depends on other people present. So sort of this extra work of often having to read the room or surround oneself with trusted people. Several respondents, lots of respondents, especially those that identified with LGBTQIA+ identities, had lots of experiences with slurs, discrimination, harassment, bullying, and microaggressions. Folks definitely felt safe if they had an LGBTQIA identity in rural or conservative settings than in urban or progressive settings. And then a couple other interesting things came out from those that didn't have LGBTQIA identities. So women in general, regardless of whether they identified as a trans woman or queer plus, they said they felt less safe, greater bias, less respect, less belonging as a woman or as just somebody that presented as feminine. And then lots of folks that responded, of course, did not identify as gender expansive or queer plus. And a lot of those folks mentioned that they acknowledge their privilege and that they feel safe as a member of a dominant group. So that was a really interesting finding. So what can we do to support our LGBTQIA+ community? Some of the things that folks mentioned in their responses is addressing bullying and harassment through policies and practices, improving workplace cultural norms, increasing mentorship support from work or school peers, especially those trained or informed in inclusive practices, increasing community building or social opportunities, especially to meet other folks that hold LGBTQIA identities, and then also providing anonymous feedback systems. Okay, so I want to wrap up with my sixth and final insight, and that's that a social justice lens can generate novel research. And so as I started out in this talk, I mentioned that I do a lot of research in acoustic ecology. And that led me to this work where my lab and I looked at the impacts of inequitable noise in cities on urban people and wildlife. Specifically, we were interested in the historically racially targeted practice known as redlining. And this was done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation to disinvest in certain neighborhoods in cities across the US until the 1930s. So certain neighborhoods were outlined in red, as shown here on this map. And those neighborhoods were essentially neighborhoods where the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, dictated that lenders should refuse to make loans to buyers in those neighborhoods. And these were communities of color and of lower income. Other neighborhoods were outlined in green, like here, and were given an A grade. And it was recommended that lenders make maximum loans to buyers in these neighborhoods. And these were largely white, wealthy communities. And we have several stats and figures, and I only pulled out a couple, but they tell the same story, that redline communities experience greater noise pollution. So this figure here shows that essentially the number of cities with noise at different levels. So we looked at 83 cities across the US and quantified noise across the different redlining categories. And so cities with A-graded neighborhoods, more cities with A-graded neighborhoods have noise levels below 70 decibels, okay? This is the EPA upper limit of noise to avoid health impacts. There's also more cities with D-graded neighborhoods that have noise levels above 90 decibels. So above 70 and above 90 decibels. So above the EPA upper limit, and then also importantly, 90 decibels is the noise level at which serious damage can occur to humans after 8 hours of exposure. So there's clear evidence that noise is not equitably distributed across this racially targeted practice of redlining. And we also conducted a literature review to assess impacts to wildlife from increasing noise. So the graph here shows that as noise levels increase, they get higher to this sort of higher maximum noise level more commonly found in redline neighborhoods. The cumulative percent of studies that show or document impacts to wildlife also increases. So if increasing noise didn't matter, we wouldn't see this increasing accumulation of evidence as noise gets higher. Or said another way, the percentage of studies finding effects on wildlife would taper off somewhere at a lower level, like maybe 75 decibels. But it doesn't seem to taper off until even over 100 decibels, and it's not even clear if that's a pattern given the sparse data up here. So this suggests that inequitable noise may matter, it definitely matters for people, and it may matter for wildlife too. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to leave you with this question: how might a social justice lens influence your research? So a social justice lens aligns really well with one of the main aims of NCEAS, especially the aim to conduct transformational science to allow people and nature to thrive. So hopefully that's food for thought and helps you consider the research that you do in light of social justice. Okay, I think I'm good on time, so I am going to briefly acknowledge the many folks that contributed to the work that I have shared today. Funding, my great team, my great lab team that helped with some of the work that I shared, and provide my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions, especially about a lot of the methods that I glazed over if you have questions about that, and thank you for your time and attention. And I will try and stop sharing my screen.
Sara, thank you so much for this excellent, insightful talk. Now, I'd like to open it up to the audience to start our moderated Q&A. So if you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A button to type it so we can get it. Yeah. And Sara, while we wait for questions to come in, I want to start by asking you something. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how a lot of these insights and information really go beyond ecology, environmental sciences, biology, conservation. And I can see a lot of people from different fields, watching your talk and thinking, how can I also gain insights about my own field? So I want to ask you, what is one piece of advice you would give to other scientists that are interested in doing research about DEIJ practices in their field?
Yeah, great question. I think the nice thing is there's lots of folks, regardless of your field, that are doing this work right now, right? So I'm working in this space of conservation and environmental science or biology, but I think I can't tell you how many papers that I've seen, whether you're working in veterinary science or medical fields and professions or cellular and molecular biology or whatever. Thinking broadly, I've seen many papers in many different professions where people are thinking about this, thinking about the history and legacy of oppression and exclusion and how those have shown up in various ways in their field. Because, it's not, these practices sadly are not just unique to environmental science. They manifest, they're systemic, right? They manifest in many fields and professions in different ways. So I think there's a rich literature out there, and I would suggest the first place to start is look at that literature, because I've seen many just inciting different works, many different papers in different fields that talk about these issues. So it's a good place to start learning. But then, of course, there's also a rich literature in, I would say, the ethnic studies space, right? Where they think about this in the big picture, right? So they're not thinking about this like I do in the terms of environmental science or ecology. They're thinking about all these issues on the broadest of scales, right? And so there's, that was a really eye-opening experience for me, is getting outside of my sort of world and into sort of the ethnic studies, women's studies, that type of literature. And people have been doing this work for a very long time, much longer than myself, much longer than the other folks in sort of the sciences have been doing it. So I would encourage you to deep dive into there as well. And if anybody has questions about that literature, my contact information, I put it up briefly, but I can share it again. I'm happy to share some resources, so reach out. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah, thank you. That's so kind of both this interdisciplinarity and, diving into fields that have been actually addressing these topics for a really long time.
Yes, absolutely.
So we have some comments here. Great talk. Thank you so much. Also, Danny Fernandez, thank you for a very insightful seminar. Let's see. So we're open for questions. Okay, so we have a question that says, I am aware of some emerging leaders in ecology around queer plus inclusiveness, maybe fewer so far for gender expansive inclusivity. Could this be related to differences in levels of feeling safe, greater for queer plus, or are these general patterns related to the larger society?
Oh gosh, good question. I mean, I can only speak based on the voices that showed up in our responses, right? So I'll just contextualize what I'm saying, but I certainly feel that, first of all, like a lot of folks, regardless of whether you had gender expansive identity or queer plus identity, didn't feel that conferences were a really great, safe and inclusive space for them. That came up not as often as fieldwork in rural settings came up as lacking safety and inclusion, but it came up as also not as supportive of a space. But yeah, definitely across the board in our respondents, and especially those that had intersectional identities, they commonly said something to the effect of, it depends on what part of LGBTQIA you identify with. And so like my trans identity, I feel much less safe and much less belonging in that aspect of my identity than in my queer plus identity, right? So, and again, I think that was a common theme in our responses that showed up, and it definitely showed up in the like patterns in the data as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I'm seeing in our responses.
That's very interesting, thank you. Well, for some more questions, I do have another one from your talk, which is regarding this study about participation and inclusion of undergraduate students in fieldwork. And I was very interested, it was like about the undergraduate population. And as I listened to you, I was wondering if some of these concerns about inclusion and belonging are also reflected similarly across academics in other career stages.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're saying like some of the barriers that the undergrads experienced. Is that something that I'm seeing anecdotally across other career stages as well?
Yeah, if they kind of like carry over as people go forward.
Yeah, I've certainly seen a lot of discussion around, for example, like family care conflicts for many career stages. So not just undergraduates. That is, I've seen lots of literature that shows that that's an issue regardless of career stage. And then, yeah, definitely for those that identified as having disabilities, sort of regardless of whether you're an undergraduate student or, faculty or whatever career stage you're at, getting into the field is always just harder, right? So I've had lots of anecdotes from people, and then also seen literature published talking about that. Also sort of, yeah, lots of concerns around, I guess, lack of supportive spaces in the field. I think, yes, people have experienced that at different career stages. It certainly shows up, I think, more for undergraduates, but I've seen that cascade and carry over too. I'm trying to think back across those results, but yeah, I think a lot of them carry over across career stages, and some of that's anecdotal, but then a lot of it's just other research has shown this too.
Thank you. We have another question from Grace Wu. She says, thank you, Sarah, for sharing such a wide swath of your research. She'd love to hear more about drivers of the leaky pipeline, and specifically how Purdue is building DEIJ into the tenure and promotion process.
Yeah. So, gosh, I wish I could remember the paper. There's a really fantastic paper that summarizes all the key drivers of the leaky pipeline, and I cannot think of the author at the moment, but reach out to me and I can share that article because it's in my literature list. But regardless, this paper did a really good job of summarizing everything from biases that show up at like when women write grants, to biases that show up when letters of recommendation are written for women, to biases that show up when women go up for tenure, to biases that show basically every aspect of like that promotion, every step in that promotional process, from like when a mentor is writing a letter of recommendation for their graduate student to get a postdoc position, to when a woman is writing her first grant to get funding for her research program, to when she goes up for tenure. There's a really great paper summarizing all of these sort of barriers that women experience that can lead to this idea of a leaky pipeline. So the concept is that you sort of filter out or lose women, or women sort of leak out of the system is the idea, different steps along that sort of advancement trajectory. And then, gosh, what was the other question? There's another part to that question I forgot.
The second part of the question is about Purdue's process for building DIJ into tenure and promotion process. So how are they really like concretely enabling it?
Yeah, I wish I knew, because I'm not, I haven't dug into their process very well. And so I can't really speak for the process myself, other than it explicitly values tenure and promotion in the process. But that's probably the bounds of what I know about it, since I'm not at Purdue. So I would be hesitant to speak about the entire process.
Thank you. Okay, we're getting more questions and comments. Maybe we'll take just one more question. Here it says, from one of our attendees, I often hear late career researchers say things to the effect of, I had to struggle and work hard to get where I am. It weeds out those who can't handle it. How do we change that thinking and get later career researchers to help improve work conditions so that early career researchers are not expected to suffer to advance?
Yeah, I've heard that too. And I think it's hard, right? I think as all things with DEIJ, I sort of start with the tools, the social psychological tools of empathy and perspective taking. So like trying to find the common ground of why they're saying that and why they believe that is a starting place for a conversation, right? And then usually you can find inroads from that conversation to be like, oh, well, that was difficult for you. So why would you want someone else to have the same difficult experiences? And who might, like imagine if you couldn't get past that, right? Imagine if those barriers were such that you were unable to overcome them, right? And you would never be where you are today. And so not everybody is able to get past those barriers. And so it's usually starting out with, making sure that you're not putting people on the defensive. So that empathy, that perspective taking usually is a great tool to help you like start that conversation, and then sort of navigating and unpacking some of the parts that you can to hopefully decompose like why they're feeling that way, and then get them to think about it differently. But it's hard, and that doesn't always work, if I'm being honest, right? Sometimes people just are set in that mindset. Yeah,
it's also extra work now that you were talking about the this tax.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That was very insightful and empathetic too. So before we finish, I just want to read one more comment from our attendees. It says, not a question, but I really appreciate this talk. As a queer Latina in environmental science, this talk was super validating, and it's great to see that it looks like there's responsible science being done on LGBTQIA+ people in conservation.
That's great to hear. Thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sara. We are at the hour. So for everyone here with us, I want to wrap up by thanking Dr. Sara Bombaci from Colorado State University for this fascinating talk and conversation. Sara, you would hear a resounding applause, if we were live. But thank you so much for your presentation and being here with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
And to everyone online, thank you for joining us in this first talk of the NCEAS DEIJ seminar series. And please join us again on May 31st and June 14th for our next two talks. Thanks all.
Nice seeing everyone.